Lillard is on the Milwaukee Bucks, and I'm not happy about it, but I'm also happy about it. Let's explain. Let's start with the trade. So the details are thus. Milwaukee gets Dame. Portland gets Ayton and Drew Holiday, three-teamer with Phoenix in this. They get a 29 unprotected first, pick swaps in 28-30. Why did Phoenix want to do this? Well, they get Nurkic, Grayson Allen, Nasir Little, and Keon Johnson, who hasn't really done much except be super athletic for Portland. I've always kind of liked Little a little bit. Grayson, he can shoot. He can actually provide something in a rotation. The weird thing is Phoenix feels like they have a lot of guys, but now it's kind of like, well, what about Ayton? At Ayton's peak, heading into the finals against Milwaukee a few years ago, it felt like he was flirting with some really, really great territory as a player. Could this guy be a top 20 guy? I know Bill and I probably went a little too hard on what he could eventually be, but it seemed like the perfect fit, a mobile guy who could stretch the floor a little. Whatever it is, I don't think Ayton has it. I think he's a really talented dude. He's going to put up numbers in Portland, but I don't think he has the it thing that you'd want out of somebody with a team that has championship aspirations. Now, the Milwaukee side of this is pretty simple. Dame is better than Drew Holiday, sort of, right? Because Dame is one of the most dynamic scorers. I think he'd be energized, new place, first time ever in his career. You're playing with Giannis. So the high side of this could be real problematic for the rest of the Eastern Conference. It also maybe puts you in a better position with Giannis, who I think scared a few people by being very open-minded, talking about his own future, where I think Giannis, if you look at his history, he's just a little bit more pragmatic about stuff. But some people saw this as real flirtation with moving on at some point. Maybe that solves that problem. The problem you may have now is that Dame Lillard has a consistent diet of eating screens. And in the regular season, that may not mean anything. But when you had Drew Holiday at the top of your defensive positioning, that was a lot different for the back line and everything else everybody had to do. So that's going to change things a bit. But I understand it for Milwaukee. It's kind of an all-in, all over again. I've always been kind of fascinated with how they were going to have to reinvent this thing around Giannis to keep him happy and to continue to contend throughout his prime, because where he's at, where the other players on his team were just simply older. And it's not like Dame is young. So I get that part of it. The Phoenix part, I think a lot of it had to do with just moving on from Ayton, who didn't fit in, as we've covered. I also think when you look at the money part of this, Ayton was going to be $32.5 million this year, $34 next year, $35.5 million. The only money they're really taking back here is Nurkic, and then Little's contract is minimal. It's actually a really good number for a guy that maybe is in a rotation. I don't even know if he will be with this team. I don't like Nurkic. He's hurt all the time. The defense can be atrocious. Maybe they salvage him, because there was a time there in Portland where it looked like he was going to be a real guy. So really what this comes down to is, does it make Milwaukee the favorite in the East? If Giannis is right, I still think they're the best team in the East. I mean, that whole thing got so weird, and it will be forgotten in history, of him going down and then how bad they were even when he came back and just falling apart mentally. Just watching a team fall apart mentally against the Heat is not the greatest memory ever, but it's still really weird that they lost that 1-8 matchup, and Giannis missing half the minutes in that series definitely plays a part in the whole thing. Boston, it feels like no one's really excited about them, but they're in it. They're clearly in it. Although Porzingis having a foot injury at that size isn't exactly the best news ever. But look, they weren't going to be able to get him unless they gave him an extension for him to opt into the whole thing. And that kind of leaves us with Miami. And this is why I'm not happy about the trade. Because let me start with this. When this timeline with Lillard got going, it was lingering for a little while. And then leading up to the draft, what happened? We were talking draft. It's like, well, look, Portland may want to trade that number 3 pick. And there's some idea that they've told Lillard that they were going to trade it. I will never believe that a front office would be dumb enough, especially with how hard, if you look back historically, how hard it is for lottery picks to be traded for players that are like immediate impact guys. Like, think of the landscape of NBA players and think of like, okay, which team that has a really good player that's likely a contender? It can be a number 2 or a number 3 guy. But if he's a number 2 or a 3, that means they probably have a really good number 1. So if that team's a contender, why would they trade that player to Portland for the number 3 pick and kind of reset their own timeline? Like, that trade is very, very hard to pull off. So I'll never believe, and I don't think a lot of people do believe, that they told Dame they would emphatically trade it. They may have said they'd look into it. And then when they didn't, he felt betrayed. And then it ramped up all the stuff. He starts doing interviews. He was flirting with this stuff for a while, kind of like, hey, I'll always do this for the fans, but whatever. And it was time to move on and all these different things. So then we're left with a situation that we actually are familiar with, but in this case, collectively overreacted to. Okay, it's on. Dame wants out. And we are used to players getting their way. I think the fan base of the NBA That relationship between NBA fan and NBA star is the most challenging of any fan in its league going in sports today. You get dumped on, all right? And if you were a Heat fan, of course, you wanted Dame Lillard because it just makes your team better. Okay. But if that was your argument, it wasn't really a great argument because I would look at each trade demand individually. And in this case, with Lillard, with 4 years remaining on the deal, 2 of those being a new extension that he just signed from the only team that he could offer it, and then saying, you know what, I want out. And not only do I want out, I only want to go to one fucking team. That's nasty, man. That's a nasty way of doing business. We should all that care about the NBA, all of us should want that to never be the norm. But we're so used to it being the norm that we were like, okay, wait, when's this going to happen? I remember Bill and I talking like very, very early on in July. And he's like, what's your schedule? Where are you going to be? Should we sit around to have a Dame emergency pod? And I'm like, well, I know what's going on as far as like all the stuff we're caught up in, but do I really want to burn an afternoon and wait around for 4 hours to see if he's traded today? Because then a very common sense thing dawned on me in that moment. Because as all of this was swirling around, we're waiting for the announcement as if it's inevitable. Certain people saying that it was already a done deal. That's early the first week of July, which didn't really make any sense. Woj had made some comments being like, Portland doesn't like the Miami offer. They're going to see what happens. And it's like, hey, you know what's weird about all of us is when we have a major decision to make, we can have a position that we think we're married to, and then time goes by. And in this case, it was a few months. There can be things in your life you are determined to do or not to do. But then when you get to that actual, I have to make the decision date, you start to make compromises. And that's what I always thought was important about this timeline. Portland doesn't like the Miami offer. He only wants to play in Miami. Well, it's July. Let's see what happens. And what happened was we almost got to October. Dame clearly changed his mind. Portland got better offers or felt like they were better. And I really don't want to debate like whether or not Hero is better long-term than Ayton and Drew Holiday. As much as I understand the warts on Ayton, let's see what the entire package is. There's also a part of this too, where you don't even want to be trading for Miami picks down the road because it's just such a great organization that their bad isn't really as bad as most teams. So I think you factor that in as well. But it almost felt like it was a rarity to be going, well, why do they have to do this now? Why do they have to do it now? Hey, I run a basketball team. The best player doesn't want to play here. And he only wants to go to one team, which sort of screws up his entire market. And it sounds like his agents are working against us, scaring other teams off. Well, it is July. So maybe we'll see what happens. And guess what happened? People's mind changed. The thing about the Miami part, and this is where I am happy, it's not about the Heat. I know some of you can never remove the fact that I'm from Massachusetts about this and whatever. I mean, honestly, if you want to go Celtics homer angle, this is worse for the Celtics than Dame on the Heat, to be honest with you. The best version of this, the best version of Dame and Giannis working together. So if you can allow yourself to believe me on that, the part that I love is that there was this massive tribal disconnect. The people in Miami couldn't understand why people outside of Miami didn't like this. And the reason I didn't like it is everything I just laid out. We should not be cool with a guy with 4 years left and a new extension saying, hey, I want out and I only want to go to one team. That's a shitty relationship for the fan and an NBA player. It's so bad. If you don't believe me, Adam Silver touched on this topic. But the disconnect was Miami guy going, why doesn't everybody else get it? Those idiots. And the idiots on the outside were kind of like, so wait, you're right because it benefits the thing that you like? Think how flawed that logic is. I'm sorry I have to do it because I couldn't believe it when it happened. But Woj came on and said very simply, Portland doesn't like the offers. They're going to see what happens. Dan Le Batard said this about Woj. Quote, thank you for bringing up Woj. The Heat know that he's just agenda-based shilling bought and paid for by Portland. It's embarrassing that Woj is telling people it might be weeks or months on Lillard. That was on July 17th. Bought and paid for. I'm like, man, if you're going to pick a fight with somebody who gets shit wrong. Not Woj. And here we are, weeks, months later, and it wasn't Miami. So what's the lesson in all of this? I think the lesson is, even though the standard seems to be NBA player says this, NBA player gets exactly what he wants, specific to when this was all going down and the lack of options, there was nothing wrong with a team waiting it out. You want to argue the Miami offer would have been better, the 3 or 4 first round picks. I don't know if it was ever going to get to 4 and Hero. I do always like Jovic a little bit. We'll see what happens with Drew Holiday. You know, trades are weird where the history comes back. You're like, Aaron Aflalo ended up being the best piece in that massive deal, years removed. But I know, at least I'll look at it this way. The next time we're faced with something like this, where a team just goes, whatever, we don't like the offer, I'm not going to plan on an emergency podcast the day we hear the request.